Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Classical Wisdom webinar. My name is Anya Leonard, and I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom. We're a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds, and part of that is having these regular events where we talk about really important modern issues with the perspective of the ancient world. And we have two very esteemed panelists today, which I'm very excited to introduce to you. They're very knowledgeable in exactly these fields. So one, we have Brook Manville. He is an independent consultant who writes about politics, democracy, technology, business, previously a partner at McKinsey Co. and an award-winning professor at Northwestern University. He is the author of The Origins of Citizenship in Ancient Athens and A Company of Citizens, What's the World's First Democracy Teaches Leaders About Creating Great Organizations. And that was done with Josiah Ober, who is the Konstantin Mitsotakis Professor at the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is the author of The Rise and Fall of Classical Greece, Democracy and Knowledge, Innovation and Learning in Classical Athens, The Greeks and the Rational, and the Discovery of Practical Reason, among other books. Thank you, Brook and Josh, for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Now, we are going to be talking about your newest book, the Civic Bargain. And I think the crux of it is to talk about democracy and how we can save it. But I always like to start every question and idea and conversation with getting to the premise, like all of us good classics lovers know to do. So first, let's start with the definitions themselves. What is a democracy?
So this is a really controversial question. There are probably as many definitions of democracy as there are political theorists who study democracy. But Brook and I thought we really should get back to basics, try to come up with as lean a definition as we could. And that's what our historical research allowed us to do. So we came up with the baseline definition of democracy as having no boss except one another. That is, citizen self-government, government by a large, socially diverse body of citizens who refuse to be bossed by anybody but themselves. Now, that leaves out a lot of things that modern people tend to associate with democracy, especially the idea of basic rights. And we can get into why it's essential for self-government to use the idea, or at least have the practice of rights. But we wanted to really strip it down to say that self-government is really the essence of what democracy has always been.
And is this a form of government that is good? I mean, is democracy the best form of government, or is it the best we have?
Yeah, of course, Churchill famously said, the worst, except for all of the others that have been tried from time to time. But I think Brook and I want to argue that, in fact, that it's much more than that, that democracy is good for both negative and positive reasons. It's good in that negative sense, that it's good not to have a boot on your neck. It's good not to be bossed around by someone else when you have the capacity to rule yourself. And it's good in the positive sense, and this is really leaning on some of Aristotle's thought, in the positive sense that it allows us as human beings to fully manifest the basic capacities that we have as humans. So those capacities include sociability. We're really remarkably sociable as a species. We're capable of cooperation in ways that at least other kind of primates are not. We have the capacity to use reason to think about both advantage and disadvantage, but also right and wrong, just and unjust. And we're highly communicative. We have the use of language. So you put those three things together, sociability, use of reason, and language, and you really get democracy. What is democracy? But it is using our reason to try to think about how to live well together, communicating the reasons that we have to one another through language, through discourse, through deliberation, and in so doing, trying to create the best society, the best form of sociability that is available to us. So I think in that sense, democracy allows us to be fully human, as well as keeping that boot off our neck.
And
I
Brooke,
think
yeah,
the thing that we really emphasize just in everyday conversation is just the importance of individual freedom, but freedom that has to be essentially continually negotiated in order to live in a community. But, through history, there's all sorts of reasons to say, look, people with more freedom produce more good things. They sometimes produce bad things, but we think that the freedom of the individual and the individual contextualized and working with others is really the most important part of the story.
And Brooke, what about what it means to be a citizen specifically, like the smallest component of this democracy?
Well, again, many books beyond mine have been written about it, but it's essentially, you have certain freedoms and benefits from being part of that community, and with that you have certain duties, and that nature of being a citizen must be relatively well defined, and over time it must continuously be renewed because the whole notion of who is a citizen will change. And we, again, we use the very simple contrast that being a citizen is the opposite of being a subject, where you have to follow the lead of some boss, whether it's a king, a tyrant, an oligarch, or whatever.
And currently, I mean, part of the premise of this conversation again was how to save democracy, but is democracy in trouble? I mean, are we in a moment right now that we need to question democracy and fix it?
Well, I would start off by saying only half flip. Democracy is always in trouble because it is always vulnerable to, all the things that we are seeing today in extreme gridlock, polarization, eruptions of violent conflict. So yes, I think that anybody who is looking around objectively saying, yeah, things are in trouble. The Pollyannas say, well, we've been through things like this before. In America, fought the Civil War, of course, but it doesn't mean that that we aren't in trouble in some level, because these are not good things to have. The system doesn't work well when things are polarized, when people make enemies of one another. When people, show, grandstand for the act of their own personalities and not some version of the common good. So yeah, we are in trouble, but one of the messages of our book is that democracy is never done. You need to constantly be working at it because it is sort of an unnatural act. It's harder to make democracy work than to make autocracy work. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people in places like the United States today tend to forget. I mean, it's hard to get a democracy up and running, and it's hard to keep it going.
Now, I want to get into the meat of the discussion, but I want to ask one more question first, because I can see it kind of popping up in the chat, but it's also something I've had quite a few of my readers write in to ask about: what is the difference between a democracy and a republic? Because a lot of people are saying, well, America isn't really a democracy, so this doesn't really fit. So I think maybe we can clarify that now. The rest of the conversation will probably be more relevant to everyone.
Yeah. So the republic, not a democracy, is a line that was at least made famous by James Madison in the Federalist Papers. So Madison had a very strict idea about what democracy was. He thought it was basically what Plato said Athens was like, that is, mob rule. And he was very determined not to have that. So he had as a vision the alternative, which was basically a Roman notion, or at least a republic, an ancient Roman notion of a republic. We say that actually this is a false dichotomy. If you actually look at how Athens really was run, and frankly, we now know because of another 200 years of scholarship, a good deal more about how Athens was really run than Madison could have known. And the fact is that Athens had both representative institutions. That was one of the key distinctions that he thought that democracy was always direct, and that a republic would be the rule of representatives. Well, Athens did have representative institutions. We know a lot of about how the Council of 500 worked at Athens, which was a representative body. And furthermore, Madison thought that democracy always rejected the rule of law, that you couldn't have true rule of law because the mob would always be making up its own rules as it went along. And once again, because we know a lot more about democracy now in the age of Plato and Aristotle, and we have a lot of documentary evidence from the inscriptions that have been excavated, once again, since Madison's time. And we know that the Athenians became very concerned with the rule of law and built in constraints that pushed back against the tendency for the majority to become simply tyrannical. So if you take democracy as no boss, that's the same thing that the ancient Roman Republic was committed to. The Roman Republic was built on the rejection of a king running things. In the same way that the Athenian democracy was built on the rejection of a tyrant running things. So that no boss but one another as the core definition of democracy brings together democracy and the republic. And as soon as we recognize that representation and rule of law can be characteristic of both republican and democratic systems, I think we can just throw away that invidious distinction.
Yeah, I would just quickly add one other thing. I mean, most of your listeners will know the sort of the cliche that history is studied by some people who are splitters and others who are lumpers. Our book is more of a lumper. It's very clear that the British parliamentary system and ancient Roman Republic and Athens, and of course the American Constitution, have some big in-your-face differences. We understand that. If you read our book, we're inviting you to take a leap and say, be more of a lumper for a little bit. Think about if you expansively define and simply define democracy as no boss, and that it's communities of citizens working to live and make decisions together, and to do so having to bargain with one another because they don't want to have a boss. Then you can make a lot of interesting comparisons, but there will be differences, and we acknowledge that. But it's really sort of, inviting you into a living room where it's a more expansive look at multiple cases at the same time, and from that to start to tease out some insights which we think are relevant to all democracies today.
Well, I think your explanation of the lumpers versus the splitters is a very good one, and I think I always like to take a moment to remind everybody, in the spirit of which we come to these conversations, is to kind of understand truths and ideas. And sometimes by being able to compare different systems at different times, we can see patterns that maybe we won't be able to see if we try to see the differences too much, if we get into the nitty-gritty and split. So the idea is to take a step back and see all these different political systems and find what has enabled them to continue to survive. And your book is How Democracy Survives. So maybe this is a good time to look into the specifics about what is the civic bargain. What are some of the elements that can allow us to help democracy or essentially to having no boss?
Yeah, thanks. The core of our argument in the book really is that, yeah, democracy depends upon a bargain among citizens. And that really means that it's an agreement among a body of people who agree to be self-governing, who agree not to be ruled by a boss. They have to agree then on the rules by which they're going to live together. And they have to agree on who gets what and who gives what. That is, how the benefits and the costs of living together in a society are going to be distributed. Now, of course, every society has to decide that, but in a boss-run society, in a tyranny or a kingship, it's the boss who decides. In a democracy, we have to decide that together. And the only way we can decide that together is by negotiating with one another, because a bargain means that nobody gets everything they want, but presumably everybody gets more than they would get outside the bargain. So it's got to be a positive sum bargain. It has to be win-win, even though nobody wins at all. So how do you then do that? Well, the first thing in terms of the basic conditions that are necessary for such a bargain to work is that you have to be guaranteeing at least baseline security and welfare. If I'm much better off materially or in terms of security under the rule of a boss, I'm probably going to choose that. So that's a baseline condition. And the next condition is we have to decide who is a citizen. If we're going to rule ourselves, who are we? And that means there have to be some decisions about who's at the bargaining table and who's not, and that how do we ever change that over time? How do we admit then new citizens? And those are hard questions, but they have to be answered. And then the next thing is we have to actually establish the institutions that we're going to run ourselves by. And though there's all kinds of variation, as Brook was saying, parliamentary and so on. But we have to have an agreement about that, and we have to have an agreement about how those institutions can be changed as circumstances change. So all of this really comes down to a willingness by citizens to negotiate. So that's really the core thing. If you can't negotiate, you can't strike a bargain. If you can't accept that you're not going to get everything you want every time you're at the negotiating table, it's not going to work. So good faith negotiation is really at the center of this, the basic conditions for democracy. And how do we do that? Under what circumstance can we negotiate with one another? Well, here we employ another concept from Aristotle, and that is civic friendship. We have to treat one another as friends, not enemies. Now, friends, civic friends, doesn't mean necessarily we all like each other, doesn't mean we want to all be chums, but it does mean that we recognize that we're in a common enterprise together. We're not enemies trying to destroy each other. As soon as we start treating each other as enemies, it becomes impossible to negotiate in good faith, and the bargain is at risk. And then ultimately, how do you learn to treat your fellow citizens as civic friends rather than enemies? Well, this requires the education for citizens. It requires a civic education. And every successful democracy that we've studied has various ways in which citizens educate one another in the basic conditions and the basic values that they share, such that they can go on together in a society. So that's really a big payoff for us in the end in the book, is that what really needs to be done if we're to save democracy is to rethink how we educate one another as citizens.
The thing I would just quickly jump in, because I think when we've explained this concept, sometimes people at the beginning are confused. The bargain has some very tangible pieces. You can point to the American Constitution, or you can point to the Clisthenic order, the Roman, Roman institutions, et cetera, and say, well, okay, that was part of the bargain of how it was going to work. The rules of the game would be that, you would fight as a hoplite, but you would also go to the assembly and vote as a citizen if you were in Athens. But there are clearly some softer, more intangible parts of it. There's this kind of notion of a shared understanding about how we are going to live and work together. And what makes it so difficult when people talk about fixing democracy is sometimes they tend to stress only one, the institutions. We have to get rid of the Supreme Court in the United States, or, the Athenian problem was that, they didn't include, medics in the assembly, whatever. But there are also these more intangible parts that are also part of the bargain. We call them sometimes norms. How are people going to act towards one another? How are people going to essentially say, well, it's not perfect, but I'm going to get along with one another well enough because I want to have common security, I want to have some common welfare, and I want to have some freedom so that I'm heard. And so the bargain kind of lives in documents or in laws, but it also lives kind of more in the penumbra, to use that famous word from our Supreme Courts. There's a notion of how do we get along? How do we actually treat one another to make this experiment work?
And so to make this experiment work, I mean, what kind of strategies and patterns do we need no matter what? I mean, and is there a difference between these patterns and strategies that we need for creating the democracy in the first place or for maintaining it?
Well, I think Josh already touched on sort of, we tried to come down to a lean list of 7 fundamentals, so that no matter what, these are kind of the rules of the game and the way that people are going to play. And so, one of the ones that is much talked about today is you can't turn your political opponents into enemies. You can't campaign on killing people who disagree with you or undermining what the democracy has agreed to through some kind of process. You're welcome to disagree, but you have to kind of follow law. You have to follow certain norms of how you're going to work. You're not going to get perfection. You have to be willing to compromise. So, people say something like, well, if there isn't freedom of abortion, this is no longer a democracy. Or, if I don't have, my church in charge of all schooling, this is no longer a democracy. Well, you can't say that kind of thing. You have to be willing to compromise, because humans always disagree. And, the game starts with a bunch of humans coming together saying, we want to rule ourselves, and say, okay, fine, sounds lovely. But you realize that you might not actually get everything you want. I mean, this sounds like a sort of a grade school kind of explanation, but so many people tend to forget it. We've gotten so polarized in today's societies. People stand up and say, you're ruining democracy, or you're killing democracy. Well, why is that? Because you want to have something different than I want for this particular, tax law or whatever. They don't understand that isn't how the baseball game is being played. And so it's getting back to this notion of compromise and just getting along with each another while having some very hard criteria around things like who is a citizen, who is not, and are we going to prioritize making sure we don't get invaded tomorrow over some other more petty conversations. I mean, so it's this hard and more soft, intangible stuff that has to go together, which I think is one of the reasons it makes the idea of saving democracy sort of complicated. There's no single lever you can pull, to use that phrase. There's a lot of things, and it's the citizens who have to come together to do that together, or else it will no longer be a democracy.
For these 7 conditions, I mean, do you have to have all of them, or like if you're missing just one, does it all fall apart? I mean, is it kind of like a part of the whole puzzle?
Well,
Yeah,
to
we
get
really do see it as a package, right, Brooke? I mean, it's a when you think about it, we can sort of work our way, either forward from no boss on down or backwards. So if you have civic education of the right sort, then you can begin to understand your fellow citizens as your civic friends, which enables you to negotiate over institutions, decide on the hard questions about citizenship, sustain security and welfare, and do it with no boss. Any one of those that is missing is going to, in a sense, break the chain and at least put the capacity of citizens to rule themselves to, once again, Aristotle's term, rule and be ruled in their turn. It's going to put that in danger.
the thing I would add to that, though, back to your question, Annika, which I did not mean to dodge, which it's an important one. Does democracy getting started, is that different than democracy continuing? And I think the important part of this notion of the package is that if you look back at the four cases that we looked at, and we would argue democracy in general, those pieces tend to come together over time. And one of the kind of ideas of the book, which takes you beyond, in many ways, the traditional narratives, is a lot of traditional narratives about democracy focus particularly on the revolution, throwing out the boss, get rid of the king, get rid of the aristocrats who were ruling in Athens, get rid of the elites and the kings in Rome, get rid of the king in Britain. But in actual fact, the real work of democracy is after the revolution. It's when people start to say, okay, we are now free, at least temporarily, assuming the guy doesn't come back. How are we going to organize ourselves? And that's a lot harder to do, because that's when the real negotiation starts. People who want to be free can bond together and say, we're in this together, get rid of the king. But then it's like, okay, now how are we going to actually make this work? I sometimes use the joke about like the dog that chases the car. It seems like a good idea to chase the car for the dog, but then the dog gets to the car and goes, well, what do I do now? And it's that, what do I do now, which makes democracy so difficult. And many of those pieces start to come together after the fact. Like when you're first building the thing, you don't have to worry a whole lot about civic education. But as you start to institutionalize, this is how democracy is working, then civic education becomes really important. The other thing I would add is that the front end, before there is the revolution, also is when some of those pieces start to form in kind of embryo. The British case, for example, in part, before there was a official parliament in London, there were large public councils where kings in Anglo-Saxon times would convene people in local townships, and of course they had groups of advisors, and they started to understand, how do you work with people without necessarily having total absolute control, giving certain people their say. In Athens, of course, Solon brokered some very important compromises that created essentially proto-citizenship, which then became richer and more detailed once the Cleisthenes Revolution took place. So you can see that our story is really not only about revolution, which is still important, but much more about evolution, and that anybody who studies evolution knows that evolution must continue. So to your question, Annika, a lot of what goes into building democracy has to be kept going, although it may take some different forms. And then some of the parts of the deal, parts of the bargain may need to change when we decide, no, actually, we think, slaves should be freed and should be allowed to be part of the American citizen population, and so on and so forth. So I think it is a both and. It is different when there's revolution for a moment, but then it must continue, and much of what continues actually had begun before the revolution even started.
Now, I just want to tell everybody that we're going to do a Q&A in about 15 minutes. and we'll be accepting questions from the audience. So please feel free to start putting questions in the chat that we can collect. And I want to get into how some of these ideas are really relevant to us right now, because I think that's really important. But before we do right now, I want to go back in history, because that's what we do here at Classical Wisdom. And I kind of want to understand a little bit about the importance of ancient history in coming to understand democracy now. Like what can the democracy in Greece and the Republic in Rome teach us for right now about how to understand our current situation?
Yeah, so Brooke and I were both trained as historians of antiquity, so we do have a dog in the fight, thinking this stuff is both really intrinsically interesting and really genuinely important. I think at least one way to think about this is that when we look at contemporary democracy, whether it's in the US or in Europe or in other parts of the world, it's a hot topic, and it engages our emotions. It should, because that's where we live. That's where we are now. That if we only look at these sort of hot topics, we're going to, I think, be missing some of the fundamentals that sit underneath the contemporary circumstance, the contemporary problems, the contemporary issues that we struggle with today. So looking at antiquity allows us to step back. We may care about antiquity, but we don't care about what happened to the Greeks and the Romans in the same kind of passionate way that we care about what's happening to us right now in our own countries. And so it allows us then, I think, to abstract from our own circumstance and from, in some ways, the distractions of modernity, even abstract from our obsession with technology, which I think, once again, it's important, but it can be sort of all-consuming. Looking at antiquity allows us to really get beneath the surface and begin to understand how it is that large numbers of citizens could come together, rule themselves for long periods of time, for hundreds of years, how they could manage to deal with really substantial crises, as both the Athenians and the Romans certainly did, and yet sustained by, in many cases, finding ways to adjust the basic bargain by which they lived. And the other thing is that antiquity allows us to see the whole story. It allows us to see the origins. It allows us to see the sort of the flourishing, and it allows us to see the end. And so we can actually look back and ask, how does democracy survive? How is it that democratic republics go on? In part by looking at how do they fail? How were they ultimately overtaken by events, both internal and external? Once again, in the world we live in, we don't know the end of the story yet. We don't know how it's going to end. And so we are lacking in some of the data that we really need in order to answer this core question that we ask, how does democracy survive? So, we would urge that history does matter, and a serious understanding of history matters. And if we're going to think about civic education in the 21st century, we firmly believe that it ought to include thinking about what happened in the centuries BC.
Josh, I would add to that. I'm going to stick my neck out a little further. It's hard to argue with history mattering, but let me make a sort of a provocative assertion about why ancient history really matters a lot today. I think if you look around what's going on in modern politics, in certain ways, we are getting less modern, in the sense that because of technology and other changes in the world economy, people are becoming more and more involved or wanting to be more involved in how decisions get made. They don't feel that they can just simply trust their congressional representative or trust their president here in the United States, particularly if they didn't vote for them. And they want their voices to be heard. They want to participate. And so in many ways, the democratic debate, as it were, is starting to get much more Athenian, that people are, wanting a say, and they want a quid pro quo for being a member. So much of recent democratic discussion in the Anglo-American case was essentially, how do you protect the rights from this impersonal, encroaching government? Well, now it's much more not just how do I protect myself from the government, but how do I become part of the government because I'm not happy with how the government is working for me. And I think, once you go down that route, then he goes, whoa, there's a lot of lessons over in these folks in ancient Athens, and also in somewhat different ways in Rome. You had a much more participative mindset. And in some ways it went wrong, and in some ways it went right. And as a result, not surprisingly, a lot of political scientists are beginning to say, well, we feel like we're in a Roman moment now. What's going on here? Can't we adopt some Athenian practices and take advantage of technology where people really can participate? So I think those ancient lessons are becoming oddly more potentially relevant now.
I love the point that that history it's a great way to talk about things that are potentially hot topics, and the idea that more and more people have a voice, whether it be on Twitter and social media, or just the ability to connect with each other more and more. But at the same time, I mean, we are seeing this greater polarization occurring, and it's amazing how it used to be. Like, there's some really fascinating statistics that, not that like in the 70s or the 80s, like people between different party lines would still marry each other and things like that. And now, I don't think Democrats and Republicans can even be friends half the time. It seems, specifically in America, but all over the world. So the $1 million question is, like, how do we attempt to fix this polarization? How do we find this civic bargain in right now? How can we promote and nurture the ideas of compromise?
Yeah, and I think that's a very hard question. Our answer really goes to our seventh condition, and that is civic education. It's not a quick fix, but in the conversations I've been having, I run a program at Stanford called the Civics Initiative. I've been talking with people around the country, and it's remarkable how much response I get when I say, what we need is better education of citizens. We need to get back to a kind of basic idea of what it is to be a citizen, what are the rights and duties of citizens. I get positive response from people on the left and people on the right. People are pretty far on the left and people are pretty far on the right, and they all basically agree, yeah, that's right. Now we'll have to think then about what is the content of civic education. But I think we can once again agree that part of the core of civic education is going to have to be being able to talk with one another, being able to reason with one another, and being able to bargain with one another. So at least one way to think about this is that we all engage in bargaining all the time, more or less every day. Every time you go into a store or online and purchase something, you're engaged in a bargaining situation. The seller, in his ideal position, would he'd get your money and wouldn't have to give you the thing, and maybe your ideal situation is getting the thing and not giving the money. But you both know that's not going to happen. You're going to come to some agreement about what the thing is worth, and you're both better better off because, I get the thing and you get the money. We do this constantly. And yet, when we go to our political lives, we find, we can't possibly do that. That would be a compromise. A compromise is bad. It's a sellout. No, it's exactly the same thing that we do day to day in our lives. It's essential, and it's what we need to do if we're going to sustain a world in which we actually can govern ourselves rather than simply being told what to do by by a dictator.
There's another important kind of strategic point here, and just rounding back to your question about the issue of scale, Anya. So one of the themes that we stress in the book is that democracies have to keep working at their civic bargain and renewing it, and in some cases literally altering it, because they're all on this conveyor belt with a big dilemma we call the challenge of scale, which is, over time, if you start to be successful and have freedom and it starts to work, people want to come. They want to emigrate. The natural birth rate often tends to go up, and people want to come and be part of what usually becomes an increasing economy. The problem is then you have a more complex and more diverse society. And over time, it attracts more and more people. And you look in the world today, people are getting on rafts and going all over the place. Where are they headed? They're headed for democracies. People say, well, democracy is so evil. Well, I don't see a lot of people, emigrating to Russia or China or North Korea. So once you start to get a more complex society, it gets real difficulty, because the, quote, homogeneity of beliefs, which I think is an overstated notion, but if there was any homogeneity, it gets more difficult because you got a more complex demographic profile of your population. At the same time, it's a dilemma because democracies all live in tough neighborhoods. You've got to keep getting bigger when you've got big, powerful neighbors with more nuclear weapons and more armies and more aircraft carriers. You have to be able to stand up to them. So you got to get bigger. Now, if you are clever in your democracy, and you read one of Josh's earlier books, you understand that diversity of ideas creates more innovation. But you have to put up with people shouting and screaming at each other in the meantime. So you have to manage that. And it certainly gets harder. So again, this challenge of scale, there's no escaping it. It just comes with the territory, but you got to make it work because the world doesn't stop. And that's why, I think it's useful to use the phrase, which many other historians and political scientists say, that democracy is an experiment. It has to be tested and revised, and something goes wrong or starts to fail, you've got to try again. Well, our message is, you have to keep trying and fixing it. The Athenian case is full of tweaks, to use that word, to how the quote Athenian constitution worked. Romans too continued to develop the different kinds of institutions. In both cases, the tweaks or the changes were not sufficient to ward off what became collapse or invasion. I think modern democracies face that danger. So we will have to get along with one another and learn how to do it through, we would argue, bargaining better and compromising better. Because if we don't, we will collapse and be small and not able to stand up for ourselves against, a lot of hostile neighbors. It's very interesting that the foreign policy community now is increasingly looking at fixing our democracy as a strategic challenge. One of the first reviews of our book that just came out was actually in Foreign Affairs magazine. Who would have thought?
It's amazing. It's interesting to think too about the role of culture when it comes to the ability to bargain and compromise. And recently we did an event on Seneca and about stoicism and anger, and it was really interesting because Seneca is sort of talking about how there's never a good time to be angry. And the irony is that people in the audience and then people responding to it were like, no, they got really angry about this comment. And I think we're living right now in a time where people sort of embrace this idea of righteous anger, like a thumos almost, where it's totally allowed to be angry. But then when people go in with anger, and they feel like they're totally justified of being angry, then you can't talk. I mean, it's almost impossible to talk to somebody rationally if you're angry. But I like to bring up to turn to our audience questions because we have so many, and I think they're going to be quite fruitful for discussion. So this one from Dimitri, I think, is good as a follow-up from the comment I just brought, but does party affiliation ruin the opportunity to be respectful to each other as individuals?
This is something that we confronted in writing the book. Is where do political parties come in? And it's one of the useful things about looking at ancient democracy is that they didn't have political parties. There certainly were factions. There were groups of people who were advocating for some particular interest. There were groups that formed around, a local political leader. But there was nothing like the organized political parties with political platforms that go on for generations, or at least survive the collapse of the authority of a particular leader. Interestingly, democracy doesn't require parties. Can it survive parties? I think is now the question that we have to ask ourselves. I think that really gets to the heart of what are parties about. Well, political parties are about ruling, about getting authority to run things and keeping it. I think that as citizens, we have to recognize that is the danger that parties basically the danger that they present is that they'd like to stay in power permanently. They'd like to be a boss, and that we the citizens have to recognize that whatever our party affiliation, we need to have a deeper affiliation with the idea of our civic bargain, the democracy, the form of self-government that we have, and we have to be willing to bail out from our partisan party affiliations when they're beginning to threaten democracy. Once again, how are you going to get people to do that? The only story I can have is that you've got to build from the beginning, and you have to develop a form of civic education that allows people to see how very dangerous it is when a political party starts to act as if their goal was to keep power permanently. And at that point, we have to recognize that that's a danger just as much as the king or the tyrant was in Athens or Rome.
The other interesting point is that the political environment is very fluid right now. That in many ways, parties, some used to argue, were a great stabilizing influence in our system. Well, they are under a lot of pressure now. People can do their own fundraising with the internet. They can build their own affinity groups. We have a presidential candidate who may not actually even participate in the party primary system because he's got his own band of followers. And so parties, I think, are not necessarily here forever, or at least as we understand them. So answering the question of what do we do about parties, I think is a moving target, and it's going to come back again to a more fundamental identity that people have to decide, which is, am I willing to do what I need to do to preserve the freedom that democracy potentially provides?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting for people who sometimes live in different countries or study different democracies and governments around the world to realize that in America, it's very strange that there are really only two parties, and that the correlations between, say, economic and social issues are somehow integrated in people's minds. And yet in other countries and cultures, you can have a very economically conservative culture party that is very socially liberal. The two things are not automatically put together. And so I think that kind of comes back to your point, Josh, about the importance of civic education. And so I'd like to ask the question, how does that look like? What does that look like? Who gets to decide the civic education? Because obviously, historically, education can also be indoctrination. So where is that line drawn, and who gets to draw it?
Yeah, I think there is never going to be, for any given country, certainly not in as diverse a country as the United States, one civic education that is standard for everybody. But I think there can be models of a form of public education of citizens that have a lot of shared features. So that's what we're trying to do at Stanford University, is develop a model of civic education that is suitable for the first instance, higher education, university level. What sort of things ought someone who's attending a university to know about the problems of citizenship. But our goal is really to create a model that could be adopted by other colleges, universities, ultimately rolled down for K-12, younger students, and could be adopted by citizen groups, could be adopted across other countries on various platforms. So I think we've got to start in various places, offering models and putting them out there and see what works. Once again, I'm very optimistic that there is a deep desire for a turn towards civism, if you were, being a citizen. And I think that really is, that transcends party. But we've got to try to develop models and experiment. And as Brooke said, democracy is experimental, and so is going to have to be the development of a form of civic education that is suitable to our age, to the 21st century. It's not going to be the same one from the 19th century, and it's certainly not going to be the same one that worked for Athens in the 4th century BC.
But Anya, your question about indoctrination versus broad-based education, I mean, it's a blurry line, but we have to be willing to say, there are certain things, at least from the standpoint of managing our scale, that we do share and we do agree with. I mean, for example, in the United States, we have to respect the Constitution, and we have to understand what the Constitution is. Doesn't mean the Constitution can't be changed, shouldn't be changed. The founders put that provision in, of course. But if we don't have some level of commonality about, again, how the game is played, our essential conditions, our civic bargain, then we won't be able to maintain the scale that we need to defend ourselves and to live, relatively happy and prosperous lives. If everybody is constantly only on their own, with no interest in ever agreeing with anybody else and always wanting to do everything unburdened of any duties, you can't have an organization, you can't have a community. So it's a tension. It's been a tension through history. But I think the pendulum probably went too far in the last 20 years that any kind of civic education is indoctrination of the worst possible sort. And we see natural interest bubbling up, as Josh mentioned, and what he's doing at Stanford is one more part of the bubble. People are saying, we got to have something. We got to pull ourselves together. It's going to look different than what my grandfather learned in school, but we have to have something. And okay, so what's it going to be? This is again another chapter in the experiment.
So continue. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, that's really what our book is about, is saying, well, here's our thought. Here's a grounding for civic education. Here are 7 conditions that enable a democracy, enable the self-government by citizens. We propose that as a foundation on which you could build a whole variety of forms of civic education, of varieties of civic education, but would have this common core of recognizing without these conditions, the thing's not going to work.
So the following question, an extension of this, and this one's from Richard, was, but what if the negotiation hits an impasse? Like, what do we do when that happens? Is there somebody that we can decide on? Is there another authority to appeal to? What happens when people don't bargain or can't, I guess?
And in the worst instance, when people don't bargain, when people walk away from the bargaining table, then you fight, right? I mean, if there's something that has to be decided, or some outcome that has to follow, then the alternative to bargaining is fighting. And that's really high cost. I think that is what drives people to the bargaining table and keeps them there, is the recognition that the cost of fighting is really catastrophically hard. We see that in the Athens case. Brook was mentioning the bargain that Solon basically negotiated between the wealthy Athenians and the impoverished Athenians that avoided a catastrophic civil war. We see that with the negotiations between the plebeians and the patricians, always hard bargaining, might have broken down, but was sustained such that Rome was able to defend itself against its enemies. So yeah, one of the really important things, I think, is recognizing that we mustn't let impasse. We must recognize that the stakes are actually very high. In some ways, the success of contemporary democracy, the fact that we've created a world in which we have a lot of security and a lot of welfare, has allowed us to think that the stakes are pretty low, and we can walk away from the bargaining table, walk away from negotiations over various substantive issues without cost. But at some point you can't. And that's, once again, part of the argument we want to make, is that let's remember how high the stakes are, remember what can be lost if you're not willing to negotiate.
To go back to sort of historical examples, you've drawn on 4 democracies that have worked. This is a question from Diane. What are some of the democracies that failed, and what can we learn from those?
Well, there are, lots and lots of democracies that have failed in the modern world, and there's really a large literature on this that. When we started thinking about our book, we read a lot of this literature, and it's often about how democracies die. This literature typically looks at a range of things that have happened, typically in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So there's no lack of that kind of. We can look at how things go off the rails, how the guardrails collapse, and so on. But we felt that the focus on failure, and especially failure of contemporary or modern 21st century democracies, was missing the point that there are conditions that enable successful democracies to survive. So we encourage you to read the How Democracies Fail literature. It's very enlightening. But if you stick with that, you end up, I think, at least you worried, you may end up with a sense that it's all over. We're doomed. It's just a countdown to, or maybe it's already failed. But we want to say that it's too early to say that. And there are survival conditions, and we ought to attend to those as well.
Um, can I also ask for the definition of a democracy that has not failed? Like, does it have to be running for X amount of years to qualify? Because, of course, all the democracies you have mentioned in your book, with the exception of one that or two that are still going, I mean, have eventually ended. So,
Yeah, so I don't think we had, Brooke, just interesting question. We never came up with it has to have survived for X number of years or X number of generations. But we figured that the cases we were looking at had indeed survived and had survived crises for at least a couple of hundred years. So figure, a couple hundred years isn't bad. And there are many cases of democracies that fail much more quickly than that. So say, 5 or 6 human generations, that makes a good test case for things that, for a system that survived.
Again, I think we have to avoid the perfection trap. We were sort of looking at living cases that existed in history, and they lasted hundreds of years, and that was different than most democracies, because most democracies fail or just become de facto dictatorships. But you have to avoid saying, you study about if people follow a certain diet and plan of exercise, they have a chance to extend their life a little bit and live more prosperous lives while they're doing it. And the comeback is, oh, well, they're going to die anyway, so why do you even bother? I mean, who knows? We don't know how long it's going to be. We were really just trying to say, for those that hung on for a long time and had a fair amount of freedom and diversity that they were able to manage for a relatively long time, what did they do to keep going for that long time? I mean, that's the extent of our, quote, scientific promise to you. But we think it's still valuable because we are today, those of us who live in what we believe are democracies, are part of a continuing experiment.
Yeah, and Anya, it goes back to the thing that you asked at the very beginning. Is there some good to all of this? And if you actually believe that, it is worse to live under a dictator, a tyrant, whether it's an individual or a gang. And there's lots of grim historical experience with that. So if you think it's better not to do that, democracy is your only alternative. We see it in very binary terms. You can either rule yourselves, or you can be ruled by a tyrant or a junta. And we think that there's good reasons to prefer the one, and therefore to think seriously about the conditions that sustain that.
Now, I'm going to, next question, take you a little bit out of antiquity. This one's from Glees Whitney. Thank you so much for this discussion. I look forward to familiarizing myself with your work, and I know your work is anchored in antiquity. Do you also deal with Tocqueville and his observation that modern American democracy tends to atomize people, which can lead to their isolation and alienation from the community?
Good. Yeah, so Tocqueville has these two sides. He's worried about alienation, but he's also fascinated that in America, there were so many associations, voluntary associations of many sorts that brought people together and in which people made decisions locally about things that mattered to them. So I think democracy both has this, Brooke was, I think, putting his finger on it, this tendency to give us a great deal of individual freedom, maybe leading finally to alienation, to a rejection of the thought that any sort of community really matters or is sustainable. But it also builds on this, what Aristotle would imagine as our natural sociability, our natural desire to work with our fellow humans, our fellows towards some sort of purposeful end. So I think that we need to attend to both sides of what Tocqueville taught us, is that if you look at democracy in America, as he did, what you're startled by is both the freedom of the individual with its potential alienation, but also its tendency to create these strong forms of association in which people work together towards some common end.
As a matter of fact, I think de Tocqueville was really that tension that Josh just mentioned is a perfect microcosm of the democratic dilemma. He traveled around at a time when America was expanding out west, and we tend to characterize the pioneers as rugged individuals who would brave all the terrors of moving into Indian territory and territory of wild animals, and there was no. But lo and behold, they also figured out how to band together to help each other when there was a fire in the middle of town or there was a drought. And so it's this tension between individual freedom and collaborative association with some sense of democratic decision making, if you like, for the common good. And it's not surprising that there's all sorts of studies to your questioner's point about in America, and modern life is very alienating. People are more lonely. They feel disconnected, and many of the suggestions of improvement are Robert Putnam's work is relevant here. Is we need to kind of rebuild the Tocquevillian culture to bring that sort of undercarriage of democratic association back into the broader culture on which and realize how much we depend on it.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you said Putnam, Bowling Alone is like a perfect example of this kind of trajectory, I think, in American culture specifically, like more so than maybe other cultures. And it's something I love about living in Latin America, because society is so much more community based that generations get together every week, and you really feel that sense of connection when you go to your little local shop and you're buying your fish every week, and the fish lady knows your daughter and makes funny faces with the fish, and it's all about being much more human. But the premise of that question too, and this is from Charles, is why would the majority care about or protect the view of an individual citizen? So getting right to the heart of the question. I don't know if that's solvable.
I think that the simple answer is that if you are properly educated, once again, as a citizen, you realize that the majority must care about the individual or about the minority, because every one of us is an individual, and every one of us is a minority, one way and another. We all have interests that are our own, and that are certainly not shared by the majority. And so the idea that there's some kind of sort of simple mass majority that is going to be making decisions that are hostile to every individual and every possible majority is only going to eventuate if people don't have the understanding of this reality, that their judgments that they make, the choices they make, the deals they negotiate when they are in the majority have to recognize that they won't always be in the majority. They have to recognize that if you're going to keep this thing going, you've got to be looking out for your fellow citizens in a way that isn't simply win-lose. I'm in the majority, I get to have everything. You are in the minority, you get to have nothing. You do that, we're in a world of civic enmity, not friendship, and self-government becomes impossible. If we take that on board, we're not going to ever be that kind of crushing majority that sees its advantage in simply stripping others of their rights.
Yeah, I also want to just again puncture this kind of bubble of universal security for the asking. I mean, there is a value to maintaining some level of citizen solidarity, and you just have to sort of accept that some of the people who are going to pay taxes with you and join in defending the nation, if it is deeply threatened, may not agree with you on every issue. And when the Persian War was underway and they were signing up people to row in the triremes, they didn't say, before you pick up this oar, what's your stance on spending money on the Acropolis? I mean, they had to hang together. And we have to hang together today. Those of us who are in what we believe are democracies have to hang together. It doesn't mean we have to agree, but it does mean we can't, deeply demonize fellow citizens on whom we ultimately depend today.
I fear there's sometimes cognitive dissonance in that people do seem to forget that they are a minority in some way, and just think about what they want at that moment. I mean, I guess, how do we help individuals not see each other as enemies?
Yeah, and partly I think this is we can play on two things. One is people's deep sense of self-interest. If you care about your own interest, once you understand that it is in fact dependent on, you are in an interdependent relationship with the others in your community, you will recognize, as Brooke says, is you simply can't afford to treat the others as enemies. And on the other side, our self-interest doesn't have to reduce to me and mine. The sense of self-interest, rightly understood, can be very expansive. It can include, what we normally think of as altruistic motivations. But so I think that humans, if we think of ourselves as both self-interested and as having a tendency to create communities, once again, this is Aristotle, if we can teach ourselves that this is who we are, and that the kind of behavior that is destructive of community and destructive of the interests of each of us individually is ultimately suicidal, then we can go forward. Now, maybe we can't manage to do that, and maybe things will fall apart. But I think that we certainly can say that it is up to us to try, and trying is playing on. We're not pushing against some kind of a adamantine door that will never open. The door will swing open because humans, in fact, do better when they can collaborate, when they can cooperate, and ultimately when they can create a bargain by which they can live well.
This question is regarding the polarization again, but from a different angle, from Jim. Is not the polarization really perpetrated by a political class, which can be defined in many ways, as a smokescreen to keep the masses voters in line? So this is sort of it's definitely been a tactic in the past, divide and conquer. Is that something that's occurring now? Is that something we need to be aware of?
Brooke, you want to do that one, or?
I mean, I'm sure that some of that phenomenon is at work. I think it stretches my imagination to believe that there was some vast conspiracy underway to do this. I think a version of what the questioner is suggesting is happening in terms of the role of social media and media companies, which clearly benefit from more and more audience, more and more followers, and unfortunately, part of our human brain loves conflict, and loves people arguing. And that's just as long as we have a sort of a for-profit model for our media companies, there's going to be more of that. It's up to us, I think, to push back and to not be seduced by that. There was a funny article in today's Wall Street Journal saying, could we please just have a Trump-free Thursday, just so everybody could, not have to listen more about Donald Trump and the arguments about him. And you can pick, maybe you have a Biden-free Wednesday. I'm not trying to pick on Trump necessarily, but it's just the polarization becomes the news, and unfortunately people love it, just like they love to go to a boxing match or love to go to a dogfight. But that's kind of part of the brain that we have to sort of address with civic education and say, look, sometimes disagreement brought literally to conflict is not the best thing, or there's a dose of it, but there shouldn't be 24/7 of it. So I don't see it so much as a conspiracy, as just kind of a part of human nature, which we have to sort of control and push back on and think higher and more long range, because constant fighting ends up being nihilistic destruction.
I think you're right about the fourth estate really having let us down. That media has been quite conscripted of late, and it's very interesting. My husband's a writer and was originally trained as a journalist, and it's funny when you think about how headlines used to have the structure, the rigid rules you had to follow to be a journalist back in the day. And now you read a headline and like the language, the slant, the bias, I mean, for non-opinion pieces, it's absolutely appalling. But I want to, and we've got to finish up pretty soon. And so I want to read out actually a comment from Rick, who I've spoken to in the past, and I know is a lover of both classics and education. And I thought this was a really good comment. And he said, "Isn't the foundation of a civic education an element of how to think versus what to think? Combining the American principles embedded in the Constitution with developing the ability of individuals to discourse, think of a multidisciplined manner, and adapt to and influence each other's perspectives has the opportunity to create the foundation for a consensus-driven civic society. Civic classes are the seminal experience that enables the conversation that can lead to our national agreement." And I thought that was just a really, really good point from Rick about how civic education can be about how to think rather than specifically what.
That's a great point, Rick. Thank you very much for that. I would just add that we need to then have some data with which to think. Once you have understood how to think, how to reason with others, how to listen to other viewpoints before you are convinced that yours is the only one that is possibly valid, that the background data of history can be a very useful way to think about, once we know how to think about what works and what doesn't, what has succeeded and what has failed. So history doesn't have to be, it's not dispositive. It doesn't tell us exactly what to do now. Our lessons from history are not going to automatically get us forward, but it does give us the material with which to think. So how to think and then material with which to think, I think comes together nicely. And this is at least, once again, back to your question, Anya, about why the past, why the ancients? Well, they do give us this kind of material with which to think and ways to then potentially choose different directions for going forward.
I think critical thinking is absolutely fundamental. So again, thank you to Rick for that point. The only thing I would add is I do think it's time for the pendulum to swing, and I feel it is swinging a little bit now, that the sort of modern view that there are no facts, everything is negotiable, nothing can ever be known. I mean, I think we do have to look to a world where we do believe that certain things do exist, that certain things did happen, and that the lessons or the facts of history can be argued about and discussed in many different ways. But we can't get to the point where we no longer want to admit the reality of anything because it's all contextually based and politically idealized, et cetera. So I just want to be cautious that a little bit of what to think, I think, is still going to be helpful. And I think we have to sort of let the pendulum swing a little bit back towards that because we've been so antagonistic to that in recent years.
Now, you guys have both been so generous with your time that I'd like to finish up with one final question. And it was because I really enjoyed reading your book, The Civic Bargain. And one thing I really liked about it was your sort of focus on resilience and optimism rather than just sort of a pessimistic death view, which I think culturally is sort of been a bit more the norm of late. So I want to ask you, why do you think it's important that we shift our perspective on this regarding democracy?
I guess I'll let Brooke have the final word here, but I would say because if we recognize that democracy is constantly about experimentation, then we have to at least keep this optimistic thought that the experiment could succeed. That's something that we do, the actions that we take, whether it's rebuilding civic education or whether it's deciding on a marginal tax rate, could actually make things better, could allow us to go on together to a better world. If you imagine that experiment can only ever fail, then you won't want to engage in the experiment, and you end up in sort of the sad position of saying the world is awful, can't be improved, and so I'm a realist. That seems to me the wrong kind of realism, a realism that is self-fulfilling in its pessimism.
It helps provide a source of human motivation. I mean, I'm a so-so tennis player, but I play every week, and I know going into most games I'm probably going to lose, especially if the other players more highly ranked. But I'd never pick up my racket if I said, unless I can win, I'm not doing this. We have to kind of keep working to get better. I mean, everything about the democracies that we looked at that was all about a bunch of people trying, often failing, but often succeeded to make the system work a little bit better and a little bit more democratically. And democracy is never done, and there's still opportunity, and we just think the opportunity is not worth throwing away.
I think that is beautifully said from both of you, and I think that is a wonderful way for us to finish today. I hope everybody's enjoyed it and learned as much as I have, and that we have a renewed interest in being civic and civil and learning how to be better citizens and to teach the next generation that as well. So thank you so much, Josh and Brooke, for joining us today. And thank you to our entire audience for joining us and for your questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, audience.
Yeah.
Have a good one. Bye, guys.